I did a version of this talk on Saturday at a festival, and after an hour, someone started waving at me to stop. So it's going to be really interesting putting it into 15 minutes. 3 or 4 years ago, I had this idea that I wanted to write a ghost story. And what inspired me for this idea was the fact that a few years before that, quite a few years actually before that, my husband and I had bought a cottage in the Suffolk village of Bloomsbury. It's a village that I'd been visiting for years. My grandparents had a house there that they bought in the 30s when they came from Germany to England, and they were looking for a sort of alternative idyll to the one that they'd left behind on the Baltic coast. Around that time, various other, as we call them in the family, sort of Freudy people had migrated to the village, and the house that we were buying was owned by one of these people. He was an old friend of a cousin of my father's, and they had met in an internment camp on the Isle of Man during the Second World War, and he had eventually bought this cottage from him, and that cottage had been bought from a Viennese psychoanalyst friend of my grandparents. So they had, this couple, they were elderly, they didn't want this house anymore, and they wanted to sell it, being childless, as they called it, back into the family. So we couldn't believe our luck. We went up to visit the house. It was a very overgrown, rather kind of spooky, dark cottage that I'd never noticed in all the years I'd been going to the village. And we went and talked to them, and they said that they weren't going to offer it to anyone else, but there was one slightly eccentric condition, that they wanted to leave everything in the house just as it was. I personally love a second-hand shop. Now I owned one. I mean, it wasn't really until we moved in that I realized the full sort of brilliance of this situation, because they had left everything in the house, but so had my great-uncle, who I'd never met, so had the Viennese psychoanalyst, and everything was labeled. So there was a huge rock of amethyst sitting on the table. It was the first thing I noticed. It said amethyst on it. I thought, strange. But then I realized the napkin rings, because when they said they were going to leave everything in the house, they really did mean everything. The beds were made up. There were towels on the towel rack. There was a tea cozy in a little drawer by the kettle. There were napkins. It was extraordinary. It was the most well-stocked house that after a while I started going, I can't find a colander. Hang on. I'm feeling quite outraged when anything was missing. So I thought, yes, I was just thinking about some of the funniest labels, the things that I particularly loved, because I became obsessed with the craziness of the labeling system. There was a lovely old wooden chest in the back hall that said rags and dusters. And I thought, that would be nicer without the label. So I peeled off the label, but underneath it said rags, which showed me just to what extent the labeling had been kept up. He also provided us with a history of the house, and it was called The History of the Blue Anchor. And it turned out that this house, for hundreds of years, had actually been the village pub. And he traced the landlords of this pub back to 1735, and their various tragic, short-lived stories. Many families, 10 children, 2 surviving. The landlord falling drunken into the well on his way back from market, a grandmother who drowned herself in the water butt, sort of went on and on like this. But then in 1927, the pub was demolished to make room for a larger building, and an enterprising builder took it by wheelbarrow, bit by bit, and rebuilt it as a cottage at the top of the village where it still stands. One of the other things that was in the history of the Blue Anchor was the fact that the great Scottish architect, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, had at one point stayed at the inn. So I was quite interested in this. But I liked the idea that sort of standing in the house, which was laid out just as the pub had been, I could imagine that there was Charles Rennie Mackintosh sitting there having a drink. But there was one other thing in the house that no one mentioned, and it was the fact that there was a small ghost in the back hall, just near this red chest with rags and dusters on, in fact. It had once been the kitchen, and I didn't mention the ghost to anyone either, but I was always aware of him as I passed through. He was definitely from the olden days. He had come with the building when it had been moved, I felt sure, because he had a cap on and short trousers. And he wasn't scary or threatening, but he was quite proprietorial. And as I walked through, I always used to feel that I must say, I know you're there. And I was very aware that he had been there a lot longer than me. I thought, listen, surely I have everything I need to write a novel. I've got the labels, which I was particularly taken with, the ghost, Charles Rennie Mackintosh somehow surely could get in, the fact that this was once a pub, I don't know. I just felt really confident about it, and I sat down and I began. I chose a young woman narrator. She had 2 young children to give her a slight, is she being haunted or is she just overtired element to the story. And I wasn't sure how I was going to get Charles Rennie Mackintosh in, but I started to do some research on him, and I thought maybe she could be researching his life in some way. However well thought out a book is, there are all sorts of things that creep in that you never intend, and there seemed to be the most inordinate amount of kind of dreary housekeeping things that were creeping into this book. You know, the mother was always having to see to her children, and because the house was so run down, builders were in, kitchen extension, God, I was getting so bored by it that I one day thought maybe I could give the ghost a voice. And so I just sat there for a while. I put quite a few pages of a year's work to one side, and I just allowed myself to write. My name is Thomas Maggs. I was born upstairs in the small bedroom, not in the smallest room with the outshot window where I sleep now, or in the main room that is kept for guests, summer visitors who write. And I thought, yes, that's the voice that's going to tell my story. And I suddenly saw that I didn't need all these complicated paraphernalia of the ghost story and the labels. What I could have was Thomas Maggs, the landlord of the Blue Anchor's son, the surviving boy from one of the families that had lost so many children, and he could be sitting there in the snug bar, which was now a kitchen, when Charles Rennie Mackintosh walks in 1914. I had found out by now, having done some research, that he was a heavy drinker, so he would be definitely appearing at the door of the Blue Anchor. Once I'd begun with Thomas, I was on my way quite quickly, and I had imagined I won't go back to those other many pages, but I never did. I started in on his friendship and his relationship with Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and the more I researched his life, the more fascinated I was by him. What we imagine when we hear about Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and earlier this year when the Glasgow School of Art caught fire, there was such an outpouring of international grief. This man's great work of art should be damaged in any way. But in his lifetime, he was very much overlooked and in some ways forgotten. He had one point in his life where things did go incredibly well for him. When he was 27, he was a student at the Glasgow School of Art, as it was then. He was also a junior assistant at the firm of Honeyman and Keppie, an architectural firm, when the director of the Glasgow School of Art, Francis Newbery, decided that it was so important that Glasgow should have their own purpose-built art school. And he put out a competition for someone to design this building on a very difficult, steep, sloping site in Glasgow. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, aged 27, won the commission, and they raised some money, and building work began. It took them 3 years to build the first half of the building before they ran out of money. But when they did, they decided that they would open the school anyway, and that they would use the school while they raised the rest of the money. There was much excitement about the opening of Glasgow's first art school. There was a big dinner, there was a ceremony, there were many, many speeches, 9 in all, to which Mr. Honeyman and Mr. Keppie were invited. But Mackintosh wasn't invited to the opening of the art school, and never during that evening was his name mentioned. One day, he said, I hope that my own work will bear my name. And after that, in the 7 years that it took for them to raise the money for the second phase of the art school to be built, he worked ferociously hard. He built another school, he built churches, he built private houses for loyal clients. He also married an incredibly talented artist, Margaret MacDonald, of whom he said, "She has genius where I have only talent, and she is half, if not three-quarters, in all my designs." And together, they designed incredible interiors, metalwork, furniture, and worked harmoniously together. When the 7 years had passed and the money had been raised, the second phase of the art school was built. And by now, Mackintosh was a very different architect than the one he'd been at 27. And he tried incredibly hard to redraw his plans. He created the library, the famous library at the Glasgow School of Art. He added a new floor, he made another staircase, and he had to fight every day with the people in charge of the budget for his vision to be realized. But it was, and when it was finished, even though in Who's Who of 1911 it said, "The Glasgow School of Art, designed by John Keppie, with assistance from Charles Rennie Mackintosh," even so, it was recognized that he was the designer of this great building. I would have imagined that from that point on, this would be the beginning of his career, the high point. But in fact, he was such a perfectionist, and he was so difficult for people to work with, and so ahead of his time. One of his friends said about him, "You were born too late. You should have been around in the 15th century with Leonardo and that lot." And he just wasn't employed. He left Honeyman and Keppie, he set up on his own, and he waited. But no work came in. And eventually, distraught and tired and ill, he left Glasgow with his wife, Margaret MacDonald, and they went to Walberswick. Francis Newbery, the Glasgow School of Art director, had a house there, and he suggested it would be a wonderful place for Mackintosh to recover himself, as many people have over the years. And he arrived, and he had an idea that he would do a series of watercolor pictures of local flowers, and he had a colleague in Germany who was planning to publish them in a book. Mackintosh was desperately in need of money by this time. They were living off a tiny inheritance of his wife. And this might have all worked out, but within a month of arriving in Walberswick, the First World War was declared. And most people left the village. It was considered to be a very dangerous part of the coast, right there on the bulging east coast. You could hear the guns, apparently, coming across from Flanders. And Mackintosh didn't leave like everybody else. He stayed. He carried on with his watercolors. He carried on writing and receiving letters from Germany, and he walked with his binoculars along the coast, deep in thought, obviously desperately thinking how he was going to resurrect his career. The village slowly became suspicious of him. There were posters saying, "Beware of spies, beware of loose talk." And the village, which had always been very welcoming to strangers and foreigners, as they were to our family, they felt that they must be suspicious of this man. What was this thick guttural accent? Where did he come from? And eventually, Mackintosh was reported to the authorities, and he was arrested, patriotic as he was, and he was banned from the counties of Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk. And he and his wife left Suffolk. And he never did, in fact, design anything on a large scale again. He turned from his career as being an architect and found solace in painting and nature, which had been his first love. And he died at the age of 60, and his entire estate was valued at £68. But I was pleased to read in this history of the Blue Anchor that after the war, he defied his ban, and he came back to Walberswick, and he did, in fact, take a room at the Blue Anchor. And I've discovered as well that he didn't sleep in the main room, the guest room, as I had always seen it, but he had taken a room in the small room with the outshot window, and I like to think that he slept well there. Thank you.